Okay, we're going to try and think about how people felt on the first Easter Sunday. But, so people say, in this country, we're not very good at showing our emotions. So we're going to have a practice first, okay? So I want you all to look really sad. Come on, I want some really sad faces. Look down at your feet. Oh, there's some good miserable ones there. Good. Okay, now I want you to look... No smiling, that's not... I want you to look worried. Think of the worst thing that could happen to you. Look really worried. Okay? Now, I want you to look frightened. Let's see some really scared faces. Oh, good one over there. Yeah. Okay. And now, excited. You can jump up and down if you want to. But, wow! Ah! And have we got any... Oh, two more. Puzzled. Okay. And this is a harder one to do, so I'm going to suggest the way we do it. The last one is full of love, and I want you to hold your arms out as if you're going to run and embrace somebody. Okay? Right, you got all those? Right, let's go. It was very early in the morning, and the women were going to the tomb. They take an ointment, because that's what you did in those days. You put it on a body. And they were very sad. To have us all sad. They were sad because they'd seen Jesus died. They thought it was going to be wonderful things with Jesus, but now it had all ended and Jesus was dead, and they were very sad. As they walked along, something occurred to them. There's a huge, great stone across the cave. They didn't put bodies in a tomb, like in the ground like we do these days. They put them in a cave. And they were, how are we going to move the stone? It's huge. We'll never be able to shift it. They were very worried. They walked along worried. And if you can do both at once, sad and worried. And as they got there, they saw the stone was gone. They began to get a bit nervous. And then they saw two men in white glowing, and they were frightened. They were not just frightened, they were terrified. What is this? And the men said, what have you come here for? To look for Jesus. He's not dead. He's alive. And you're going to meet him. And they were excited. They were so excited. You can clap your hands, you can jump up and down, whatever you like. Yay! So they ran all the way back to the disciples and they said, the tomb's empty and we've seen angels and they've told us Jesus is alive. And the disciples said, oh yeah, really? Oh, don't think that's very likely. And they were sad. Peter got up and he ran all the way to the tomb and he saw it was empty and he was puzzled. Don't know what to make of all this. Mary had also gone back, hung around, and she saw a man. She thought he was the gardener. He'll know. Where have you put the body that was in the tomb? And the man turned round and looked at her and just said one word, Mary. It was Jesus. And she was just so full of love, she wanted to run and hug him. But he said, you can't do that now, but later. I'm going to meet with you and with all the others because I really am alive. And that night they met with Jesus. All sorts of people, all sorts of disciples in the upper room. And now, can you do all these? They were amazed and excited and happy and full of love. Okay? Hooray! But what about us? You see, what we sing about is not just Jesus came back to life, but Jesus is alive 2,000 years later. That's who we celebrate. That's who we worship. That's who we can give control of our lives to. Jesus. Because Jesus is not somebody who lived a long time ago and he's gone, but Jesus is alive. And that should make us amazed and excited and happy and full of love. We're going to read from Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, the first 12 verses. Luke 24, 1 to 12. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the 3rd day be raised again." Then they remembered the words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. Have you ever wondered why the prominent people in the resurrection story are women? In a culture which was hugely male-dominated, women didn't have a greatly significant place in most areas in biblical times. And here at the resurrection, it's the women who first find out that Jesus is alive. Who were they? Well, Luke mentions 3 names. I don't know if you ever thought, it's a bit random, it seems, isn't it? You read some stories in the Gospels, and it's just a blind man, or a lame person, and you read others, and there's specific names put there. And it seems likely that what the Gospel writers did is where a person was still alive and known to the Christian community at the time that the Gospel was written, they put their name in. Almost as if to say, and yeah, you can actually go and talk to these people because they're around and you know them. And so Luke mentions 3 names and says, and the others with them. And he says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James. Mary the mother of James we know virtually nothing about. Mary Magdalene, well, Magdalene means she came from the town of Magdala. That's simple enough. Luke mentions her near the beginning of his gospel. In chapter 8, he says this, after this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12, that's the men, were with him, and also some women who'd been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. So Mary was a troubled woman. She had demons cast out of her. Tradition says she was a prostitute, but there's actually no evidence whatsoever anywhere in the Bible or any historical evidence to that. Quite how her name's been connected to that, I don't know. It's not been a bad thing in the sense that a lot of Christian mission work to prostitutes was done in the name of Mary Magdalene, but we've got no real evidence that was the case. Joanna was an interesting person. She was married to quite a high official at Herod's court. And the thing was, Mary Magdalene and Joanna and others, it says, supported Jesus financially. And you think, well, why not? Well, because in general, women didn't have any money. There were a few exceptions where women actually, because of the way their marriage contract was drawn up, had access to money and could spend it. Otherwise, it was the men that controlled the money. So Mary Magdalene and Joanna, probably reasonably well-off, high-class women. They traveled with Jesus for 3 years. You miss that in the Gospels, don't you? We're reading all the stories and we're always thinking about Peter and James and John. And we know actually there were 12 men, and we don't think about much of the others, except odd occasions they come up. And we don't think about the women at all. But these women, this group of women, traveled with Jesus. And that was most unusual. You take Joanna as an example. She's married to a guy who's a high official at Herod's court. We have to assume that he was sympathetic to Jesus, or this would never have been allowed to happen. But she leaves to travel with this sort of odd religious preacher. Well, it just wasn't done. It wasn't done because of her social class, and it wasn't done because she was a woman, and women didn't follow preachers. But in Jesus' ministry, there's this group of women who travel around with him. And you can understand why, because it helps tremendously with his ministry to women. He came not simply to minister to the religious and the males and the important. He came to minister to those who were regarded as unimportant. Women were regarded as unimportant. Children, the poor, the needy. And this group of women traveled with Jesus. Luke also mentions, when he's describing the crucifixion, he's just got almost a throwaway line. He's saying, watching at a distance were the apostles and the women who had traveled with him from Galilee. And on the first Easter Sunday, it's this group of women who've been with Jesus all through his ministry, who'd seen his death, who go out to the tomb. There are lots of cynics about the resurrection, because if you really want to disprove Christianity, what you've got to do is disprove the resurrection. If the resurrection's not true, the rest of it's a load of rubbish. And so people attack it. And one of the things they say is, oh, well, it was some kind of plot they'd invented. The disciples invented a plot and pretended that Jesus had risen from the dead. Well, if they did, they made a fatal mistake. If you were going to have a plot to pretend that Jesus had risen, you would not have had women as witnesses. In the system in those days, women couldn't give testimony in court. Women's word was not accepted except in exceptional circumstances. You'd have had, somebody like Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus or somebody like that as your witnesses. Important, wealthy, religious men, people of standing. You wouldn't have had Mary and Joanna and the other Mary as witnesses if you were making it up, if you were hatching a plot, because people say, well, they're women. Even the disciples didn't believe them. I love the disciples, because I'll let you in on a secret. I am not perfect. And when I look at them, I think, gosh, they make exactly the same mistakes that I make. And the women come running back. We've seen the angels. We've been told. Oh, yeah. And part of that would be the cultural thing. Well, it's just a group of hysterical women. And part of it will be a grief thing because, they are so distraught and so upset about the death of Jesus, they can't even grip onto hope that he might be alive. And part of it is a sort of dullness of understanding. Jesus has told them this again and again and again, and they just haven't grasped it. And that's not surprising because it's mind-boggling. If somebody says to you, I'm going to die and come back to life again, you think, oh, what are they talking about? It's not ordinary, everyday life. There's an interesting footnote on Joanna. In the end of the letter to the Romans, there's a list of names. Paul often sends greetings to people and from people. And there's a lady there called Junia. And it says, Junia and Andronicus, her husband, who are foremost among the apostles. And Junia is a Greek version of Joanna. And a theologian called Richard Baucham's written a very interesting book called Gospel Women. And he argues that it's the same person. That after the resurrection, Joanna and her husband Chusa, that's it's not a Hebrew name, but it's from that sort of Palestinian culture, set off as apostles to go and share the gospel. And of course, like people did in those days, to travel in the Gentile world, you took on Gentile names. So Joanna became Junia and Chusa became Andronicus. Can't prove it, but it's an interesting link. But what it does say is, these people were never the same again. once they'd encountered the risen Jesus. Now you see them go into the tomb, and they've got no expectations. It would have been nice, and you were telling the story, and after Jesus died, the disciples got together and said, remember all that stuff he told us about coming back to life again? Let's go down to the tomb and see that it's empty, because it's bound to be No. They went to the tomb, they had a basket of spices. The body would have been wrapped in cloths, done fairly casually because it was all of a rush because the Sabbath was coming up when they couldn't work. So they were going to do the stuff that would normally be done, which would have been to unwrap the body and anoint it with ointment and oils and then wrap it all up again. They were just going with no expectation whatsoever, apart from the fact they were going to find a dead body. They'd heard what Jesus said. They hadn't grasped it. They simply went to do a job which needed to be done. And again, people say, oh, the resurrection is just wish fulfillment. They so wanted Jesus to be alive that they saw shadows or a person or a stranger or something, and they thought, it's Jesus. No. They didn't have the slightest hope that Jesus was alive. They went expecting a dead body. Not wish fulfillment. And even when they saw evidence, they were slow to believe. They get there, the stones rolled away. How did that happen? There's no body. Where's the body gone? And then the angels give them a message. You can sort of see a bit of almost impatience, can't you, in the angel's message? What are you doing here? Why are you looking for the living amongst the dead? You've got it completely wrong. Don't you remember what he said to you? He's going to meet you. And as we've said, they go and tell the others and they're not convinced. This again is not only is it not a plot by the disciples or wish fulfillment, but this is not something they were conned into. They had to see evidence again and again and again. They kept meeting with Jesus. They kept hearing what other people had seen. 40 days of time with Jesus in different situations, in different contexts. Thomas, he ain't going to believe. No way am I going to believe in these stories about the resurrection unless I can put my hands in the nail marks, put my fingers in them. If I can't touch it, if I can't see it. And Jesus meets all these needs. He eats with them. He talks with them. He spends time with them. It took time for them to be convinced. This wasn't an overnight thing. This all adds to the power of the fact that this is true. It really happened. It's not the way you'd have written the story if you were trying to kid people. It's not the way you'd have written it if it was fiction. It's not the way you'd have written it if you were just cobbling together a few little anecdotes and trying to convince people. You see, these people wanted more than anything for Jesus to be alive. I don't think... The wonders of technology. Okay. These people wanted Jesus to be alive, but they needed convincing that he was. You see, the historical evidence for the resurrection is as good as any that we have for any of the events of this period. It's sometimes said, Christians, they believe in fairy stories. The Gospels, they were all made up hundreds of years after the events. Rubbish. The Gospels were all written in the lifetime of these events. That's as we were saying. When somebody's name was mentioned, that was because they were known and alive, and you could say, go and see that person. You don't believe that blind people get healed? Well, there's a guy called Bartimaeus, and he lives in such and such a place. You can go and talk to him. You don't think people come back from the dead? there's Lazarus. Go and have a word. And his sisters, Mary and Martha, they're still alive. This is what the gospel writers were saying. This is solid history. I can write a history of, suppose I wrote a history of the First World War. And no, I wasn't alive then. Or even the second one. I can make up all sorts of stuff. And I don't know, there may be a handful of people left alive who lived through the First World War. There ain't that many. If I went back to the Crimean War or the Wars of the Roses or whatever, of course there's nobody around. They can't contradict. Scholars can argue. But when they were writing the Gospels, they could say, go and talk to the people who were involved. This is solid historical evidence. And there are a number of people who've gone to try and disprove the resurrection who've ended up believing it because the evidence is so strong. The classic book is by a man called Frank Morrison. He was a journalist. He went out to disprove the resurrection. He ended up writing a book called Who Moved the Stone, saying it must have happened. The evidence is overwhelming. There's another bit of evidence as well. You've got this bunch of people. Most of them are not desperately significant. There are a few wealthier or more important people there, but nobody of really sort of top level. They've been with Jesus and they've seen it all screwed up. Jesus has died. That's the end of it. They don't believe anything else is going to happen. And suddenly they change. And not long afterwards, Peter is standing up and preaching to a huge crowd at Pentecost and saying, Jesus is alive. How come this bunch of very ordinary, scared, dispirited people could suddenly, confidently and powerfully proclaim the truth that Jesus is alive? People looking at them must have said, hey, there's something in the way that they talk. You know what it's like. You see a speaker and sometimes you're a bit cynical. They're telling a story and you think, oh yeah, don't believe that. But others, you see them telling the story and you think, oh wow. Yeah, they really lived through that. They know what they're talking about. There was something of this about them. And they faced persecution and they faced punishment and all sorts of deprivation because they knew it was true and they turned the world upside down. How did that happen if the resurrection is not true? You see, there's two levels to believing in the resurrection and both are important. One is, and let's never lose this because the world out there needs to hear it, solid historical fact that we've been talking about. Never discourage anybody from reading the Bible, from checking out the historians and all the rest of it. The facts are on our side. But also, facts never convinced anybody. It's a very rare person who believes on the basis of just straightforward evidence. There needs to be a human response. And like we were saying earlier, it's not Jesus came back to life and sort of went up to heaven and that's the end of it all. No, Jesus is alive and those who know him experience him in their lives by the Holy Spirit. There's an old gospel hymn, isn't there? He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along life's narrow way and goes, you ask me how I know he lives? He lives within my heart. And that's the combination of testimony to the resurrection. The historical facts are there. The disciples were changed and transformed the world. And people today, you and I, are still changed and transformed and changed the world. Never underestimate what Christians are doing in the world. If you took the church out of the world, boom, the world would miss it. Oh yeah, I think, oh, the church never does anything. Christians, oh, that's all old-fashioned and out of date. It doesn't mean anything, does it? We did in Plymouth a few years back a thing called a social audit. And it listed all the different projects, community projects, that churches were involved in the city. And it then did a kind of estimate. And it was going to cost millions of pounds if, say, the local authority or the government had to replace all that. And that's without even beginning to mention the informal things, the visits, the caring, the looking after, the stuff. I'm hearing now about people wanting to set up well-being hubs. It's coming out of the medical profession. They want to set up places where people who need company and encouragement and a chat and various other bits and pieces can come, rather than queuing up and clogging up their doctor's appointment system. And who are they looking at to provide it? Churches. We are still changing the world. So if you know Jesus, celebrate it. Rejoice. Oh, it doesn't mean we all have to be hugely over the top all the time, but be glad in your heart. Jesus is alive. We need to keep reminding ourselves of that. And find ways of showing and telling. The showing has to come first. Nobody's going to listen to somebody whose life doesn't show Jesus. But when people see that we care, when people see that the way that we live, then they're ready to listen to the words that we say. And if there's someone here this morning that doesn't know Jesus, he's here. He's alive. All you have to do is reach out. My conversion was very simple. I just say, God, if you're real, you take over my life and you run it. And God did that. It's as easy as that. Jesus is alive. We can all be changed. Amen.